think I'd like then to invite Bruce just to say a little bit about membership of the Wordsworth Conference Foundation.
Yes, and it looks like I can still share my screen, which is a good thing. If you go to the Wordsworth Conference's website, you can press on the foundation and find about the various ways that you can become a supporter of the conference foundation. And this is a kind of an important thing, because the support of the foundation is how we put together the kind of mix of scholars, both at the beginning of their careers, advanced in their careers, and in the middle of their careers. We need to support the young people so that they can come here. And it is the support of the foundation that allows us to give them the bursaries that pay a significant part of their way. So here's what you can do. To become a member or a friend of the Wordsworth Conference Foundation, you can pay a one-off life subscription of £295. Membership, as they say here, is a legal status. The trustees have to elect you, and you have to sign a liability guarantee. But that gives you a vote in the general meetings and in the election of trustees. Friends pay the same amount of money, but they don't have to vote. They don't have to go to meetings unless they want to. The other thing is that by subscribing to the Wordsworth Conference Foundation, you get a 10% discount on the fee element of the conferences, which, as Richard Gravel was very happy to say over and over again, you come here 10 years and you pay, and it's a wash. And it is pretty much a wash. And I'm not sure anybody even counts up to 15 on these things. Maybe somebody does. But it's getting close to 15 since I joined. So I don't know what that's going to mean. In any case, this is something that really that is really helpful for us to do. And the more members and friends that we have, the more that we can bring young scholars to the conference so that they can stay a full 10 days, so that they can participate both in the walks and in the discussions and in the papers. And so that, as one of our attendees once put it, so that this can remain the conference where people come as scholars and go home as friends. It is unique in that way, and we'd like to keep it that way. So anyway, that's the sermon on the amount, as the Protestant mainline preachers would put it. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Bruce. So we move now to our final panel of this one-day seminar, which again is going to concentrate on the writing of Dorothy Wordsworth. And we have 4 speakers for this panel, though in 2 groups, as it were. So our first speaker will be, and what I'm going to do is introduce all the speakers now, but we will run through them, through all the papers, and take questions at the end. So our first speaker will be Polly Atkin, a multi-award-winning writer, essayist, and poet, who I'm proud to say completed her PhD, which was on Dove Cottage at Lancaster University. Polly's work, I'm sure, will be very well known to many of you, but she's been working on a new biography of Dorothy Wordsworth called Recovering Dorothy, The Hidden Life of Dorothy Wordsworth, which focuses on the later life and disability, and will be published by Saraband in November 2021. Polly's paper will then be followed by a joint presentation from the editorial team for the new digital edition of Dorothy Wordsworth's Lake District, which is going to be published in Romantic Circles, the online journal. And the editorial team, and so our speakers for that very exciting project, will be, in the following order, Professor Nick Mason of Brigham Young University, who of course is the author of Literary Advertising and the Shaping of British Romanticism, and who was also one of the editors of the scholarly edition of William Wordsworth's Guide to the Lakes for Romantic Circles. Nick's part of that presentation will be followed by Professor Michelle Levy of Simon Fraser University. Michelle, of course, is the author of Literary Manuscript Culture in Romantic Britain and the co-author of interacting with print, elements of reading in the era of print saturation. And then the third member of the editorial team is Professor Paul Westover, who we've already heard from, at Brigham Young University, who along with Nick is one of the editors of William's Guide to the Lakes and the author of many other works such as Necromanticism, Travelling to Meet the Dead, 1750 to 1860. So the format we've got is that Polly will speak for around 20 minutes, and then Nick, Michelle and Paul will each talk for around 10 minutes on different elements of the edition. So that should leave us plenty of time for questions and discussions at the end. So thank you very much in advance to all our speakers, and I will hand over to Polly.
Thanks, Simon. And sorry for my screen sharing up and down and up and down. I thought I'd get prepared and then make the mess actually during my bit. And thank you to the conference for having me. And I'm so excited to hear about the digital edition as well, which would have made some of my life much easier, I think, over the last 10 years. So this talk's called Lost Fragments Shall Remain, Findings from Dorothy Wordsworth's Late Writings. So we all know the journals that Dorothy kept from 1798 to 1803, which must be some of the most read and most known, most talked about of literary journals. It's probably less widely known by the general public that in December 1824, not long before her 53rd birthday, Dorothy began once more to keep a journal of daily life. This she continues with pauses until 1835. Written during the years she lived at Rydal Mount, these later journals are sometimes called the Rydal Journals. At the moment, there's no published edition or even complete transcript of the Rydal Journals available to the public or to scholars. In 1978, Carl Ketchum published a highly abridged transcript of the Rydal Journals in the Wordsworth Circle, and I've been lucky to have been able to work with digitized manuscripts of the journals during the pandemic, alongside partial transcripts made by doctors Emily Standback and Anastasia Stelzer, and the novelist Kathleen Winter. Unlike the Grasmere Journals, in which you can read Dorothy's vivid accounts of moments, events, and encounters, which became some of her brother's most well-loved poems, the Rydal Journals have been seen as more personal, more domestic, and thus lacking in literary merit. Dorothy writes of visits with neighbors and friends, the weather, and her body. The entries are largely the kind of numerous trivial details that William Knight justified cutting out of his 1887 edition of the earlier journals. The title of this paper, Lost Fragments Shall Remain, comes from a poem Dorothy began in 1828, after seeing a peculiar phenomenon on Esri, an unrooted island complete with vegetation and wildlife floating loose on the water like a ship. The 1828 version of the floating island poem begins with a statement about the harmonious powers which work with nature, and presents the mystery of the floating island dissevered from the land. It is a warning of sorts. The island, she supposes, may survive for many seasons, but it cannot survive forever in this state. Nature, though we mark her not, will take away, may cease to give. This warning that nature can take as well as give becomes increasingly resonant for Dorothy the following year, when she develops a serious illness while staying with her nephew John in Leicestershire, thought at the time to have been brought on by imprudent exposure, which isn't just a phrase that the Wordsworths made up, it was a medical textbook term at the time. So imprudent exposure, i.e. she became ill from walking in the cold. Over the next 6 years, Dorothy experiences relapsing and remitting illness until a crisis in 1835, which leaves her cognitively impaired as well as physically weakened. I think we're going to hear more about the manuscripts themselves in the following talks, but I'll explain a bit about what I've been looking for in them and why. So Dorothy Wordsworth's biographers have had a peculiar predilection for killing her long before her death. Ernest de Selincourt in 1933 separates off the last 20 years of her life from 1835 to 1855 as posthumous life, life after death, belonging to her biography only insofar as they reveal in fitful gleams something of what she had once been. No one, he implies, should want or need to know about what he calls her days of insensibility or mental vagary. Helen Derbyshire follows this line in her 1958 edition of Dorothy's journals, pointing to a prolonged period of life in death before her actual death. In Life and Death, Derbyshire summons the ghastly spectre from Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, presenting Dorothy too as cursed, trapped in an in-between state, neither really living nor free to die. This reflects how many people think about disability and begins to explain the desire of biographers and scholars to choose a different ending for Dorothy, one they think is more fitting, more poetic. Frances Wilson, in her 2008 biography reissued this year, takes it furthest, calling William's marriage to Mary in October 1803 Dorothy's funeral. She describes Dorothy as fossilized for us in her Grasmere Journal, as though nothing happened to her either before or since. Thankfully, Bruce's fantastic talk has shown that that's definitely not true. Also, for a woman who lived to be 84, that seems a deliberate denial of much of her life. For Wilson, Dorothy in her later years becomes some kind of nightmare crone, literally the mad woman in the attic, with her long lost reason haunting the top of their house like the discarded first wife in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Carl Ketchum is slightly more ambiguous, placing Dorothy not in death, but in darkness, mental darkness. This echoes Millicent Fawcett's description of Dorothy in her 1889 group biography, Some Eminent Women of Our Time. Her memory was darkened and her spirits, once so blithe and gay, became clouded and dull. For Ketchum, Dorothy's illness in 1829 marks not the end of her life, but the end of Dorothy's active life as a wanderer and sightseer. With her final journal entry in November 1835, he writes, "Darkness closed in." In 1927, Catherine MacDonald MacLean presents the final decades of Dorothy's life as too terrible to behold, writing, "We turn away from contemplation of these sad, inexplicable years." This is certainly the advice most biographers have taken. So my project has been one of recovering Dorothy from this prevailing notion that her life effectively ended in 1835 or even in 1829. Almost a decade ago now, Emily Stambach and I first talked of making a full transcript of the Rydell journals available to readers, but for various reasons that couldn't happen. We believed that access to the full journals would change the narrative around Dorothy's later years by allowing everyone to see her own words and not their partial summary. Instead, in 2017, I wrote a sequence of poems using phrases from her Rydell journals, collaged together into something new, which was first published in a pamphlet in 2018 with Invisible Rain, and is the core of my forthcoming collection, Much with Body. My findings in Dorothy's late journals became a way to connect experiences, to link parallel body experiences in the same place in different times, to find a language for pain and articulation of the body through the repurposing of the words of another. Petra Kuppers has written of how, in multiple ways, pain disrupts the clear boundaries of self and language, truth and embodiment, as a history of poetic practices by people in pain shows. By combining Dorothy's language with my structure, I wanted to embody in the text something of this disruption. I also hoped I could begin to start a different conversation about Dorothy and disability, one focused more on Dorothy's findings than her loss. And then last year, I was commissioned to write a biography focusing on her later life, to put all my thoughts on this into prose. So in looking at the journals and her commonplace book, I've been particularly focused on looking for records of the illness. This has both specific and peculiar problems of absence and fragmentation. As one might expect, the iller Dorothy is, the less likely she is to write in her journal. There are gaps where she cannot write, followed by periods where she tries to catch up. This is further complicated by the fact that one of her dominating ongoing symptoms is crushing fatigue that makes it hard for her to read, concentrate, and write. Like William, Dorothy struggled with penmanship at the best of times, but in her illness, she can't sit up for long, so it becomes normal for her to write lying in bed with her paper resting on her knees. In the worst of her illness, though, she cannot write, read, or even think, as she writes here in her journal in mid-March 1835. And you can just see that at the top of the left-hand page of the manuscript. The greatest evil attending my present disordered state is that I can read or work little or none. The other gaps in the record are less organic. William's grandson, Dorothy's great-nephew, Gordon Graham Wordsworth, felt similarly to William Knight that some parts of the journal were just not for sharing. He bequeathed the family papers to the Wordsworth Trust, but before he did so, in November 1907, he made his own edits to the journal. He slices 18 pages out, covering the time period from mid-December 1831 to April 1833. He kept his own notebook, in which he transcribed parts of the destroyed entries that he deemed palatable. He introduces his notes explaining, "The entries are so full of the minute and distressing details of her malady that I have had no hesitation in excising and destroying them after making a copy of every record that seemed to me of permanent interest." The simile is page sliced out of her commonplace book as well. What I expected to find in the Bridal Journal, and did, were records of pain and sickness, but despite the scissors of Gordon Graham Wordsworth, that show acutely the physical trials Dorothy underwent in these years. Days she could not eat, or could eat only roasted bread, days she could not get out of bed, or could not sleep for pain. What I found in the journals, which I did not expect, was beauty. Even in the worst years of her illness, her journals are full of rich description and interest, of beauty, of shocking and surprising imagery, of joy in small things, the joy that keeps us going through pain, all the things we expect of her writing, in effect. A bad night is followed by a warm, misty, muzzling, bird-chaunting morning. Even when she is unable to leave her room, she writes, "I have the inexpressible comfort of fresh air in my little cell, where the glorious red of anemones becomes her treasure or winter." In spring, although she records her strength much beaten, she also sees green things burst marvelously into light. This is the record she leaves us of her illness, not of a long twilight or of darkness encroaching, but of the continual, shocking persistence of growth. Three main things bring Dorothy comfort in her illness: nature, memory, and poetry. The three are tangled up in each other. Poetry becomes a way of reigniting memories and bringing the natural world into her mind and her room, even when she can't leave her bed. Her greatest consolation is to be out in the fresh air amongst living things, but when she can't be outside, she brings the outside in. After an acute health crisis in January and February 1833, the family begin to fill her room with pot plants. William describes to Edward Cullinan how they have now in the room a beautiful bunch of primroses, which is full of promise for her, transplanted from our green terrace. The flowers are not only a beautiful distraction in and of themselves, but a kind of pact that if she keeps holding on, spring will come. Her pots and branches will come to have a powerful significance to her, the beauties of my room, as she calls them. The trees and flowers become her dear friends, like the forlorn, almost horizontal branch she describes in June 1834, which when I lie on my bed, I would not part with for £20. Her indoor garden allows her to feel connected with the wider world. On Monday, 9th March 1834, she laments, "The rain will not depart from its accustomed strongholds, but even so the rain is beautiful, glittering showers that travel over us." She's been tending her plants after the storm of the previous month, setting something in motion, she hopes, or creating the environment for positive growth. I've been sticking leafy bright green twigs of elder among my spring and winter flowers. My garden, all of the seasons, visited by the bees who solace me with their gentle humming, whilst the birds warble sweetly. And there is the industrious, cheerful bittern taking no rest. The spring still brings her warbling birds through and with her pain. This kind of green therapy happens literally, but also in memory and imagination. Her poetry brings all of that together. In 1832, Dorothy starts a collection of poems within her commonplace book, which she calls Sickbed Consolations. These sickbed consolations were begun at a time when she had been ill on and off for over 2 years, but did not imagine that she would be ill for the rest of her life. She saw her life in the sick room as something temporary, a temporary disruption, not a permanent state. It was something she had to be patient through and learn from. The poems reflect her hopes for the future, for recovery, but more than anything, they show her attempts to work out how to live with her new reality. In August 1839, in a letter to Isabella Fenwick, Dorothy splices the floating island poem to her doctor, Mr. Carr, 5 years of sickness and of pain, which she had written in 1835 after that last life-changing crisis. What does the floating island poem come to mean to Dorothy during her sickness that it did not mean before? In the Fenwick notes, William said of the floating island poem, "My poor sister takes a pleasure in repeating these verses which she composed not long before the beginning of her sad illness." There is something about the floating island, about the natural mystery of it, that seems to capture her, to connect to her present state. There seems to be something about her state that she wants to communicate through the poem. By grafting the two poems together, Dorothy makes new meaning from both of them. She's been a wanderer in the kingdom of the sick, treading a perilous path. The tranquil shore she has come to rest on in 5 years is changed when linked to the floating island from a metaphor to a real shore, an actual landscape. Thinking of this tranquil shore and the mysterious movements of the body and soul that brought her there, she has returned to the vision of the slip of earth self-loosened from the grassy shore she saw on the lake. In the older version, she describes the slip of earth that becomes the island as having been by throbbing waves long undermined. In this 1839 version, it's loosened and freed itself without violence. This impossible island, a peopled world, is passed away, long gone, she supposes, drowned and buried in the lake bed. But this is not a loss. Though the island and its past form has gone, its lost fragments persist, fertilizing other ground, subsumed into a larger whole. It's a natural theory of entropy, nothing destroyed, only translated. But sliced together with the other poem, the body of the island becomes a version of Dorothy's own body. Once it floated loose on the water, an entire world, its trees full of birds, its wild growth blooming and fruiting. But the island was always an anomaly and could not last. It is part of the mysterious harmony of nature that it should exist at all, but also that it should fail. This is the duteous task of nature, the work of harmonious powers. By 1839, her whole life seems like lost fragments, scattered, confused, confusing, loosened from the shore of her life before. But like the island, it's not gone, only different. In the 1839 version, she does not include the lines from the earlier draft about nature taking away. She's learned that lesson. It's no longer the message of the poem. The message now is focused on continuance in another form. Like many people in the early stages of an ongoing illness, in the 1830s, Dorothy imagines a recovery narrative for herself. The struggle is over, her letters and poems say, time and time again. In some ways, after the final crisis of 1835, the struggle is over. She doesn't have another life-threatening crisis. Her health fluctuates, but with fewer extreme ups and downs. Over the next 19 years, she continues much the same, not unwell in her body, but different in her mind. She becomes poor sister or old auntie. She's dependent on the care of the family and servants. She has a maid dedicated entirely to her care, because she may need attention at any time, and to manage her daily laundry, her head shaved for convenience. On her good days, she sings in happiness and makes jokes and delights in others' company. On her bad days, she weeps and rages. She writes poetry and she recites poetry. Although Dorothy didn't keep a journal after 1835, she did write occasionally in her commonplace book, making notes, copying interesting stories and bits of writing, and drafting poems. So the commonplace book continues in a way where the journal leaves off. There are entries dated 1848 and 1849. She wrote some letters we know of and more which may not have survived. In many ways, of course, this is beside the point. She did not need to write her life down for us to believe in it. Since I first heard that term darkness applied to Dorothy's later life, I've wondered time and time again what's actually meant by it. She wasn't in literal darkness, mental or physical. Increasingly, I came to think what troubles people about this period of Dorothy's life is her inarticulacy. It's not 20 years of darkness, but it is 20 years of leaving little or no account of herself in her own words. I began to think that the people who repeat this coupling of darkness with Dorothy's illness were confusing writing with life, with light. When writing is the center of your life, it can seem like life itself. I have at times myself felt that if I cannot write my life down as I go, I cannot be sure I am living it. But to assume that only people who are able to turn their days into words and write them down are in the light of their lives does a terrible disservice to non-speaking and non-writing people. I also wonder if what they mean is that these later years are the dark ages of Dorothy. not years in which Dorothy lived in darkness, but years which seem an obscure darkness to us now. This is untrue now of the historical period once known as the Dark Ages, and I hope one day it might also be untrue of Dorothy's later life. And I'm hoping that the digital edition that we're about to hear about will help solve some of those problems as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Polly, for what felt like or feels like a really valuable and necessary act of recovery. I thought that was fantastic the way you drew out those themes of beauty and growth in the fragments that you have discovered, and a great reading of Floating Island as well. So thank you very much for that. As you know, I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and comments on that, but we're going to roll on into the virtual edition, which you've nicely set up there. So thanks again, and I will hand over to Professor Nick Mason, who is the first of our three speakers about that edition.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Polly. I think I'm going to clap for everyone. I missed the audio clapping for a terrific presentation there. On a slightly melancholy note, as fate would have it, just last night, Paul and I received word that emeritus member of our department here at Brigham Young University, Gordon Thomas, passed away last night. So many of you, at least those who attended the Wordsworth conference faithfully back in the 70s and 80s, undoubtedly met Gordon and teams of BYU students that he brought to the conference over the years. So melancholy note there. Michelle, Paul, and I are going to be dividing this up into 10 minutes each. My job is to just essentially frame the edition and what we're doing here, how it came to be. Sometime within the next year, it's kind of at some level out of our hands at this point, on the Romantic Circles platform, we will be publishing this exciting new edition that we're calling Dorothy Wordsworth's Lake District. This is an edition that takes full advantage of the particular platforms of digital texts to do some exciting things that we'll show you here in a minute. It combines new presentations of familiar texts like the first part of the Grasmere Journals and several of Dorothy's poems, but as you'll see Michelle discussing, does so in ways that aren't possible or rarely accomplished in print editions. We also are, for the first time, offering some variant editions of some of Dorothy Wordsworth's Excursions, and my particular part of the edition is that we'll be publishing for the first time 2 of the 15 Untitled Journal notebooks that Polly talked about, the very first and the last volumes of that. And we'll talk more about those in a minute. So in terms of the origins of this project, this in many ways kind of grew out of, Paul, can you pull down that shared screen so I can share something here? Well, never mind. I was going to show you something, but I don't think I have my computer set up for a share, so never mind. So many of you hopefully have seen an edition that Paul and I published along with various colleagues and students 5 years ago or 6 years ago originally, of William Wordsworth's Guide to the Lakes. You can look at this on the Romantic Circles platform, and you'll see that in many ways it sort of was become a template for this new edition. One of the big goals there was accessibility. In fact, that project grew out of the fact that one of our terrific students here at BYU, Shannon Adams Stimpson, was writing a master's thesis on the interplay between visual art and William Wordsworth's letterpress in the Guide to the Lakes, but just had a devil of a time finding the first edition of the guide to find the Joseph Wilkinson sketches that William theoretically was using to direct his letterpress. So given all the work that Shannon did on that, we thought, well, it'd be great to make that publicly available. That then led to this multi-year project where we digitized, transcribed, annotated, illustrated William's Guide to the Lakes. Well, as we were coming to the end of that, which had been a really valuable project both for us and for several of our students, it also happened to be a time when we had forged a partnership with the Wordsworth Trust and BYU, especially working with Jeff Cowton, where we were going to be sending several students a year to spend roughly 3 months in Grasmere working alongside Jeff and the rest of the staff there, doing curatorial internships. And we were looking for new mentored research projects for our students. And we began just tossing around the idea of having recognized all of the ways that Dorothy's fingerprints are found throughout William's Guide to the Lakes. In fact, there are significant parts of the guide that have long been attributed to William alone. I think there's pretty clear manuscript history that shows that Dorothy wrote them. William had very little hand in them. And so we began imagining, what would Dorothy Wordsworth's Guide to the Lakes look like? If she had written a guide to the same region that, she and her brother are eponymous with in a way, what text would be involved? How would it differ from William's? This then led us to some interesting conversations with our friend and colleague, Michelle Levy of Simon Fraser University. Michelle, of course, has done very important work on Dorothy's manuscripts. And in fact, is probably certainly one of the leading scholars in our field of working with manuscripts and thinking about the manuscript to print to orality divides. And the three of us then began talking earnestly about this project of creating Dorothy Wordsworth's Guide to the Lakes. We then pitched it to romantic circles after a fair amount of back and forth about the advantages of thinking of this as a print versus a digital edition. And hopefully you'll see when Paul and Michelle speak here in a minute, several of the compelling reasons why we ultimately decided that the digital platform was best. On a democratic level, the digital platform obviously increases accessibility. Romantic Circles is an open access and kind of doggedly open access. And so no database subscription needed. Anyone can get into it. But also beyond that, just several of the technological capabilities of things that you can do with the screen that aren't as easily accomplished. So Paul, if you'll pull up the table of contents, if you have that handy.
Can you see that now?
Yes. So, okay, so now I'm seeing the lead slide. There you go. So in terms of principles of selections for what, we began by calling Dorothy Wordsworth's Guide to the Lakes. Now we're calling it Dorothy Wordsworth's Lake District. We began, the basic operating principle of selection was built into the title. We were looking specifically at texts by Dorothy about the lakes. So this obviously ruled out, several of her terrific writings that were either composed elsewhere or about other areas of Europe. So we didn't sample from, for instance, her continental journals or her Scottish journals. There's nothing from the Al Foxton Journal in this. So it's focused squarely on writings about the topography, the society, kind of the culture of Westmoreland in the early 19th century. So Paul will describe these in more detail, but the edition begins with Michelle has offered a new diplomatic transcription of the Grasmere Journal. We then include a section that Paul has edited that looks at various different manuscript copies of these two remarkable kind of brief excursions that Dorothy wrote in 1805 and 1818 of her climbs of Scawfell Pike and her excursion through Ullswater. Michelle then adds a really important new version of the poems in the Commonplace book that sets page images of the original alongside diplomatic transcriptions. We also include the green narrative that isn't shown here in this timeline, but the in many ways the most public piece of writing Dorothy ever did, the attempt to solicit funds for the orphaned green children. And then the volume ends in the same spirit as what Polly was describing, making a point that decidedly Dorothy Wordsworth's life extends well beyond the often covered years of the 1790s and the early 1800s. And that in fact, she lives a rich and relatively remarkable life deep into middle age and even into old age. So we include the two volumes of the Rydell journals, the very first, which covers 1824-25, and then the very last volume, which Polly sampled from, which covers 1834 and 1835. All told then, what we're doing in many ways is fulfilling, the spirit of something that Ernest de Selincourt said nearly 100 years ago in his Dorothy Wordsworth biography, where he wrote, "Dorothy Wordsworth has not merely given us portraits of herself and William and of their inner circle. She has left behind her a faithful picture of the world in which they moved. No one, not even her brother, has captured with a more delicate perception the distinctive beauties of the countryside in which her days were passed, nor revealed with a more penetrating sympathy the daily goings on of its lowly inhabitants." That's against the Selincourt. But in many ways, this is what our edition, which we're hoping at least parts of which will be out by Dorothy's 250th birthday later this year. This is what we're aiming to accomplish. So I'm going to turn it over to Michelle now. Michelle will be speaking about kind of some of the challenges and methods and kind of distinctive features of the editing work that went into this edition.
Thank you so much, Nick, and thank you everybody for being here. And also thank you, Polly, for that wonderful talk. And I definitely see a lot of connections between the work that we're trying to do in our kind of reimagination, representation of Dorothy. So what I'm going to talk mostly about today is the reason why we chose for this edition to return to the manuscripts and to work directly from them. And I want to explain why we made this choice, but I want to begin by saying that the reason we made this choice was not because we thought we could improve on the textual scholarship of previous editors, and in particular, Ernest de Selincourt, whom Nick has just mentioned, Pamela Wolfe, and Susan Levin, to name just a few of the sort of groundbreaking editors. Just give a second here. So we're not attempting to sort of correct or even improve upon their work because what they have done has been foundational for our own understanding of Dorothy and her legacy. Nevertheless, we wanted to return to the manuscripts for a few reasons. First, we thought that we could learn about Dorothy's writing by closely examining the artifacts themselves to better understand the texts and their textual evolution, to understand the circumstances of their making, and also to trace their circulation within her lifetime. We began this work with the belief that Dorothy took great care in preparing her manuscripts and in drafting her text. We witnessed Dorothy again and again using different material forms to create and share her writing, and revisiting her writing over many decades. There is both thought and care given to her choice of notebooks and other writing services, and the way she uses them to draft and revise, to collect her own writing and that of others, and to document and preserve shared aspects of her writing life and even of her bookmaking are important, and really evidence that's only available to us within the manuscripts. So to capture these elements, we felt that a return to the manuscripts was essential. The second reason why we wanted to source our edition directly from the manuscripts was to investigate the ways in which Dorothy was, to use Margaret Ezel's term, a social author. We find embedded in her manuscripts addresses and other marks of the social orientation of her writing. This orientation towards others, towards an audience, is found in different ways. In the poem, she dedicates or writes to others, often at their request. In her multiple copies that she handwrites to give to others. In the copying that others do of her own writing. Even in her habits of canceling passages long after she's written them, that she imagines might be painful or inappropriate for later readers, evinces an awareness of future audiences. Her manuscripts thus bear witness to their social circulation, and that is an important feature of her writing life that we wanted to capture in this edition. One of the issues that we confronted with Dorothy and putting this edition together was the range of genres she wrote in and the unevenness of the manuscript record that in part reflects these different purposes that her writing held. Our task with a work like the Grasmere Journal notebook was perhaps easier because we have only one version of it. She never returned to it to recopy it. Yet we know that even that journal, often considered her most private or personal, we know from the very first entry that she imagined her brother reading it. And we also know why she wrote it: to console herself during his absence. But of course, it continued long beyond his return. So we wanted to draw attention to the sociable nature of her journal, even though it might not have been as widely shared as some of her other writing, as well as to bring out the ways in which she used this journal to track her daily activities, from household chores, gardening, baking, cleaning, to encounters with neighbors, to, of course, the efforts that she makes to record in some detail and with some precision her walks. So consistent that it's almost possible to think about this as an 18th century version of a Fitbit. So with many other texts included in this edition, we have multiple versions and often multiple audience, both real and imagined, present and future. So these different versions often demonstrate her writing for different members of her social circle, but often the differences are small, right? And don't necessarily support what we would call a versioning model of editing. Presenting all versions, while possible within the digital realm, is not necessarily desirable and can become a burden to readers. So sometimes we know from teaching that less is more. And we have to ask ourselves, how much is too much? Would it be valuable to give in full the two different versions of the narrative concerning George and Sarah Green, even though there are very minor differences between the two complete versions? For that text, we made the decision to include variants and notes. But for other texts, particularly her two excursion narratives, we include all manuscript versions, as well as the printed version that appeared in the Guide to the Lakes. For that text, Paul has also created an illustrated reading version. And that's not something we've done for the other texts. So this critical apparatus and this editorial approach is flexible. And we believe this flexibility can reflect both the unique archive that survives for each text, but also demonstrates the adaptability of current textual theory. There is no, and indeed need be no, one size fits all. At least that's the argument we're making. We include diplomatic or near diplomatic transcriptions for all of the manuscripts as another way of bringing our readers closer to the manuscript evidence. At the same time, this is not a digital facsimile edition like we find with the Frankenstein notebooks on the Shelley Godwin archive or Jane Austen's fiction manuscript site, as we are not able to display all or even most of the page images of the manuscripts themselves. As a result, we had to ask questions about how to present materiality in manuscript pages that would not be visible to users. Would it be important for those who are looking at our site to know about line and page breaks? What about pages that have been cut out? What about blots? What about scribbled accounts and extraneous written material, such as the newspaper extracts and German exercises that pepper her notebooks? We know that Dorothy was very frugal with her paper, as were many people at the time. And so we see evidence of this kind of multi-purpose writing happening throughout the material. We did not want to replicate the practice, already mentioned by Polly, of erasing those parts we don't think are important now. And we can see how this has impacted early editors such as William Knight, who again, as has already been discussed, removed aspects of Dorothy's writing that he found unpalatable, not permanently, fortunately, as Gordon Graham Wordsworth has done. But nevertheless, hard choices had to be made. For Dove Cottage Manuscript 120, her commonplace book, in which she collects most of her poetry, we also have other material, poems written by others, newspaper clippings, transcripts of other commonplace books that Dorothy made, and so on. And we had to make the very difficult decision to only include transcripts of her poems in all of the versions that they appear. This privileging of the poetry is not ideal, but it's a hard fact that our time is not infinite. And also, we expect our users to be mostly interested in Dorothy's writing. At the same time, we itemized those entries that we exclude to at least bring them into some visibility. So it's a compromise of sorts. We also include, as Nick mentioned, only the first Grasmere Journal notebook, a practical decision we made in scoping the project. One of the benefits I have in having nearly 25,000 emails in my inbox is that I can readily locate our reference to the first time we discussed this project, at least over email, and that was on September 22nd, 2014, nearly 6 years ago. So again, 6 years may not seem that long, given the time that it's taken to produce some scholarly editions, but even we have been surprised by the amount of writing that Dorothy has left behind, and that has left us with some difficult choices. One contentious question that arose for us was what to call what we think of the Grasmere journals. And it may seem like a minor point, but I think it speaks to the challenges of working with manuscripts and attempting to edit works that were not published by the author in her lifetime. Should we use Grasmere Journal as a title? Meaning, should it be capitalized and italicized, or is this a construction of print and of her editors a description we should avoid? I was strongly against treating Grasmere Journal as a title, whereas Nick, I think, rightly urged that this is the accepted way of understanding the work right now, even if it's an editorial construction. I prevailed in this battle, I think. I think we ended up going with Grasmere Journal Notebook, capital G, lowercase j, no italics, to remind readers that what we are presenting them with are journal entries collected in a single notebook. One of the benefits, perhaps, of doing only one journal notebook for the edition is that it drives home the materiality of the notebook itself as the source of the journal entries, and also points out to readers the discontinuities between the four journal notebooks. Annotation was another area in which we had some editorial differences of approaches. I am far more minimalist, and Nick and Paul are at the other end of the spectrum. We also had some intense conversations about whether and how to draw attention to William's writing in our notes on Dorothy's writing. On the one hand, we wanted to avoid de Selincourt's approach in noting every single instance in which Dorothy alluded to one of her brother or Coleridge's poems, which, however well-intentioned, had the effect of insinuating that Dorothy's writing is important because of what it can tell us about them. On the other hand, it is obviously true that Dorothy does evoke her brother's and Coleridge's writing, and that this is an important yet essential context for understanding her work. I'm not sure we ever reached a conclusion or consensus, except to scrutinize our own impulses and to resist the invisible and almost irresistible pull to bring in the men. Still, I suspect that this is a problem specific to editors of women's writing. Do editors of Percy Shelley, William Godwin, or William Wordsworth, for that matter, concern themselves about making too many references to the writing or influence of Mary Shelley or Mary Wollstonecraft or Dorothy Wordsworth? I suspect it's not a question that even comes up. The feminist orientation of our edition is also, I believe, enforced by the return to the manuscripts, which challenge our assumptions that print is the gold standard for writing of our period. We also begin to appreciate that manuscript culture as a set of practices were at once widespread and deeply rewarding for many. Our edition seeks to challenge the continued fixation on a few offhand remarks by Dorothy, often taken out of context, about her not wishing to set herself up as an author, about her being half a poet, rather than, I'm missing my last page, hold on a second. Taking a hard look at what she wrote and how she wrote it, and how her writing was shared and appreciated in her lifetime. As we begin to see the Dorothy of the manuscripts, we find many of these prejudgments begin to slip away as we encounter a writer confident in her abilities, committed to her work, and engaging with an admiring audience. Jerome McGann has warned us as a discipline in a field that by treating textual editing as preliminary rather than integral to the study of literary works, we, quote, surrender some of our most powerful interpretive tools. We hope to prove McGann correct in our edition by offering a slightly reformulated Dorothy. We often joked that in this edition, she is Dorothy 2.0, to drive powerful new interpretations of her work. I will now turn over to Paul, who will guide us through the various components of our edition. Thanks very much.
Well, hello, everyone. I hope you now have a good sense of the philosophy of this project and what we've hoped to contribute, and also how much fun we've had working together and learning from one another. I feel really blessed to have been a part of this collaboration. I think this morning I may have the most fun job because you've now had a preview of the edition. I get to do show and tell and point out just a few of the more remarkable features of the edition and suggest how you and other scholars and maybe your students will be able to use it. I should say first, though, that because this is a digital project and the design and coding phase of the project is just now getting underway, I can't show you most parts of the edition as they will look in their final form. And some of them are just in word processing files. So I'll do my best to convey how we imagine them working. And I think we would even be interested to hear what ideas you might have, in terms of design and functionality as we bring this project to its final phase. Let me share my screen once again. And because I'll be clicking between PowerPoint slides and web tabs and so on, I hope someone will shout at me if you can't see something that I'm talking about and think you can see. But let me start where Michelle left off, talking just a little bit about the Grasmere Journal portion of the edition. One question people might have is, why do another edition of the Grasmere Journal when so many good ones already exist? It was a no-brainer, really, given the theme of the edition. This was a text that gave us Dorothy Wordsworth, the walker, the nature writer, the describer of everyday life. And I often had echoing in my head a favorite passage from Eric Robertson's book, Wordsworthshire, that he published back in 1911. he asked, "Who wrote the noblest guide to the lakes, William or Dorothy? Let the reader study every page of the Grasmere Journal before attempting to decide." So in thinking about Dorothy's guide to the lakes, it seemed like the Grasmere Journal was essential. There was the fact that it was her best known work. We knew that readers would hope and expect to see it. And then, as Michelle has said, we knew that a digital platform would allow us greater focus on the material conditions of her writing and the physical forms that it took than maybe would be possible in a print edition. So we do provide a few page images, facsimiles, to help people get a sense of how the notebook looks and feels. And then if I can get this to move forward, the real meat of this part of the edition is the warts and all diplomatic transcription that Michelle has done. This slide gives you the famous first page with Dorothy reporting on her brothers setting off for Yorkshire after dinner. So you get a helpful sense of things by seeing the words as laid out on the original pages with minimal editorial intervention. We really didn't want a sanitized text. We wanted to trust non-specialist readers, you might say, with an experience with the source material that isn't common. But we knew that specialist readers actually could also profit from this kind of presentation. The text will be fully searchable because it's online. There'll be no need for a traditional index, but all the people mentioned will be included in the edition's biographical index, which I think will be a really handy feature for lots of different researchers of Dorothy and the Wordsworth Circle. Nick told you before that the excursions are my special part of this edition. These are travel narratives that Dorothy wrote, capturing two of her most memorable adventures. And part of the rationale for talking about them together, even though they belong to quite different moments of the author's life, is that they were both incorporated in her brother's Guide to the Lakes. First, the Scaffell text in 1822, then the Ullswater text in 1823. So these are really important documents, sort of in the long-term vision of Wordsworth country that has gone down to posterity. Certainly, the guide versions of the text are important for thinking about Dorothy's reception history, even though people didn't normally acknowledge those texts as being hers. But we wanted to, again, go back to the original manuscripts because her versions, frankly, are in most ways more interesting than the published abridgments in William's book. They're longer, they're more personal. They certainly give a greater sense of her personality and her relationships with the other people involved in those texts. So we're able to present, I hope, a richer picture of these documents than has ever been possible before. We've made some fresh discoveries about the manuscripts, and that's kind of exciting. Those are explained in the apparatus. This section of the edition contains many materials you might expect, as Michelle said, digital facsimiles, transcriptions, a reading text. The reading text will work a lot like the text we did in that earlier edition of the Guide to the Lakes, in the sense that we really wanted to create a sense of the geographical context apart from everything else. So you'll be able to pop into boxes that give you pictures of locations along with textual annotations. We hope that creates a helpful kind of interaction with the text. But more than these things, we wanted to create geographical helps that wouldn't be impossible in print and take advantage of the digital platform. So I wanted to show you two tools that I've created as illustrations. And here we'll see if the technology will cooperate. So you should be seeing now a map headed Excursion on the banks of Ullswater. Please yell at me if you can't see that. This map perhaps doesn't look too exciting, but it should prove helpful when readers try to envision the itinerary and what Dorothy Wordsworth is describing in the Ullswater text. When Jeff Cowton saw the prototype, he mentioned that he hadn't realized that the itinerary was so complicated. That was heartening to me. I figured if Jeff could learn something from it, others might as well. I did notice that several people over the years have tried to give an account of this excursion, but they've been pretty inexact in how they've done it. So I think this is the most accurate sort of accounting of Dorothy's footsteps that has ever been created. You can see you can turn on or off the lines that trace her movements on any given day of the trip. You can zoom in. You can also use different map layers to see different aspects of the geography. So that's an illustration to the Ullswater text. Now I'm going to switch over to this other tool that's meant to be more immersive that we created for the Scafell Pike text. Sorry, it's just taking a moment to pull up. It's not allowing me to switch sharing, so I'm going to pop out and pop back in again. Apologies. Here we are. This tool was created with the Esri Story Map software, and maybe some of you have seen story maps before. Romantic Circles has published a few on their scholarly resources site. Some big companies, media companies have experimented with them. The New York Times uses them sometimes. Now, I know from experience in trying to share this with students that doing this over Zoom is a little bit awkward. The fun of this thing is the user's ability to scroll through the cascading text and images, working at their own pace. But I can at least give you a taste of how it works, and then I hope you'll go explore it on your own if you're interested. But we've tried to recreate the day in October 1818 when Dorothy Wordsworth and her companions climbed Scafell Pike, England's highest mountain. She was, we think, one of the first people to ever do this recreationally. She was certainly the first woman to do it and write about it. So you can see the story map includes some actual map features like this 3D map that you can zoom around and get a sense of where they went and how far they actually went and so on. In comparison with historical maps. And then the great fun of this for me was actually rewalking the route and taking photographs as illustrations so that people can walk through that day, virtually speaking. Our ideal would be to transfer everyone and take them on a field trip and walk these places. But given that we can't do that, we use multimedia. So photographs, video. And I apologize for scrolling so quickly. Again, I'm just trying to give you a sense for what this is and how it works. So we take our readers to the trailhead. Show them here's where Dorothy and her friends would have left their cart and begun walking up the mountain, and so on, all the way through the entire route and back again at the end, sometimes illustrated with historical images. So again, the kind of thing that you just couldn't do in a print edition. And let me go back to the slides quickly. Next, I want to talk about the poems. And Michelle has already given you a good introduction to this section of the edition. Let me just pull up my next pages of notes. This, I have to say, represents an incredible amount of work. Nothing like it has ever been done before, even by someone like Susan Levin, who is one of our inspirations for the project. In brief, we've got the poetry collected from this one key notebook, which is Dove Cottage Manuscript 120, where Dorothy kept multiple copies of her verses, lots of variations, and she used the pages in ways that defy the logic of print. Michelle wanted to convey a sense of the ecology of the poems, so to speak. So what we have, thanks to the generosity of the Wordsworth Trust, is first a set of page images so that people can see how the poems look. And there are lots of fun surprises and discoveries to be made with the scans. We also have, alongside these, careful diplomatic transcriptions. And then Michelle has built 3 tables of contents that will allow readers to navigate the poems in different ways. One table of contents takes you through the notebook from front to back. Another takes you from back to front, because this notebook is an amograph. Dorothy writes from both ends. So it's kind of complicated and fun to figure out how to list the contents. This table of contents that I'm showing now gives you the poems by title, allowing readers to group different versions of the poems to compare them. Again, I wish you could see how this will look once the interface is finished. We're not entirely sure ourselves, but I think it will allow people to explore the poems in lots of different ways. The value for students of Dorothy's poetry is obvious, I think. This section will also be gold for any teacher trying to help students understand things about manuscript history, the issues facing textual editors, and so on. I think it'll be a really rich resource. Now we move to Nick's largest contribution to the edition, which is this undertaking to publish the Untitled Journal. So we have, as Polly has said, Dorothy's final and most sustained effort as a diarist, 15 notebooks spanning some 11 years, and yet they're virtually unknown, except to a few specialists and enthusiasts. After all these years, they've never been published. And you say, well, why not? One reason, as has been noted, is that there's this stubborn critical tradition of focusing mainly on the early years of both William's career and Dorothy's, that has been hard to shake. Part of the problem, I think, frankly, is that some of these notebooks are incredibly difficult to decipher. This is a sample page, and you can see parts of it are quite legible, but parts of it are really difficult. And a big part of this project was just Nick cracking the code. Anyhow, it's a vast project. At the end of the day, we could not do all 15 notebooks. It would have taken us years to do it. Frankly, it would have dominated over all of the rest of the edition and been all out of proportion. However, there is a desire to do this, and I might note that Nick has been in conversations with an important academic press, and it looks like a full edition in 3 volumes of all 15 notebooks will be published in the coming years. It's going to be some 330,000 words, I think Nick told me. So I think his life has been spoken for the next 5 years. But in this edition, the decision was taken to focus on the first notebook and the last notebook. And the rationale for this is pretty simple. They're sensible bookends. At the beginning, of course, Wordsworth is still quite young. And this first notebook does not give you the picture that people have come to expect. They don't merely chronicle the sinking of their author into sickness and dementia. They show an engaged, alert, social, mature Dorothy Wordsworth, and they give a picture of the world in which the Wordsworth family is living in the 20s and 30s. So that's quite wonderful. But then on the back end, we do get this moment in Dorothy's life when the Lake District has now been shrunk down to her room, that upstairs room in Rydal Mount, where, on her best days, maybe she can go out in the wheelchair in the garden. So it's a very different kind of interaction with the Lake District and her landscape. Some of you may think of her famous poem, Thoughts on My Sickbed, about that contraction of her world and how she's now still walking, but mostly in memory and in imagination. Anyway, that's sort of the picture that we get captured in that last notebook. So we like that bookending effect. And again, the sense that we can capture the range of her entire writing life. Another important feature that Nick has built is kind of a personography that's just based on the Rydell journals. Originally, we had created our biographical index to cover the entire edition, but it became clear in working on the Rydell journals that there were so many characters that were unfamiliar, obscure characters, whether it's the physician or the neighbors or a distant cousin that comes to visit, that this had to be sort of a project on its own to make the journals intelligible to people. So Nick has undertaken this work, which again, I think will open the doors for many other researchers who will plumb this understudied part of Dorothy Wordsworth's life. So I think at this point, I should wrap up the show and tell. We are certainly happy to engage with questions or comments that you may have, or suggestions on how you would like the interface to work with some of these tools that we've created. But thank you for your attention and letting us share this project with you. It's been our companion for several years now, and we're very excited to get it out in the world and let other people enjoy it.
Well, thank you very much indeed to Nick and Michelle and Paul. In fact, I shall follow Nick's lead and give a round of applause on behalf of everyone who is watching. I'm sure what a wonderful project and what a great resource that is that you have created. And like Polly's talk, it feels again like a terrific act of recovery that you've undertaken for us there. Very striking, as I think Michelle was saying, just how much writing there is, some of which is familiar, some of which is new to us, and how much work has gone into trying to shape the presentation of that writing in such a fascinatingly accessible way for different users. Really nice to hear about the overall conception, the reasons for returning to the manuscripts, the editorial choices that have gone in, and the design and functionality, including those really great tools, those mapping tools, which I'm sure everyone will love, and everything adding up to a reformulated Dorothy, or Dorothy Point 2. So congratulations to you all. I'll throw the floor open now to anyone who may have points or questions for either the editors or for Polly. Yeah, Lisa Vargo. Yeah, please come in with your question, Lisa.
Sorry, am I? Oh, here we go.
We can hear you fine, yeah. And we can
Sorry,
see you
I'm
now.
struggling with a cat here as well. And there's some painters outside, house painters outside my window. I'll try to articulate a question. I'm just so fascinated by the editorial method that you have chosen for this edition. And for me, it dovetails into a kind of fundamental reading question I have with Dorothy Wordsworth, and that's a kind of struggle for me between how critics tend to read her as someone who uses nature, or how nature reflects herself, like the floating island poem, versus the fact that because of who she is, she can notice things in nature and the world that other people don't notice. And that may be a subtle difference, but it's not so much imposing herself on things. And that seems to me so interesting and distinctive, which makes her different from other writers. And I think there are two different kind of approaches to Dorothy Wordsworth criticism in those two ways of approaching her, though that's a simplification. it seems to me that what you're trying to do with the editing really opens up that flexible editing reminds us of Dorothy Wordsworth's own flexibility. Maybe you've already said that, but I just wondered if anybody in these fascinating talks, Polly and the editorial team would just like to say a little bit more about this, if that's a coherent question. But thank you so much. It was worth getting up early to hear these papers. It's about 9 o'clock here. Thanks.
Michelle, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I guess I've also been thinking about the way that we talk a little bit about this, the way that Dorothy's journal entries in particular have been edited over time in order to present the Dorothy as nature writer version of her. And that's both through a kind of both editing the text, but then selecting certain entries. So you really get a different understanding of what Dorothy was doing. And I suppose I feel, and this may be aligned with what Polly's talking about too, that by sort of giving you everything within a single notebook and giving it to you in the way that Dorothy wrote it, I mean, there's no such thing as an unmediated Dorothy. We know we're not giving you that, but really giving you everything, we're hoping to just kind of open up the possibility of reinterpretation. And that if you see Dorothy as, well, one of the reasons why she's talking about, you know, the bird on her doorstep is because she's like in her garden for hours every day, or she's walking, you know, she's walked a Rydal 3 times that day to get mail. So her life experiences and her daily activities are just so integral to the kinds of encounters and experiences that she has. And I guess it's our hope that by giving you everything, the full version, as full as we can, as well as kind of trying to focus attention on the fact that, you know, she's writing these at the end of the day. She's tired, like she's just been working for most of the day, or she's been sick, or again, she's been walking all day. And this is something she still takes the time to do, but at the same time, it's not central, right? Like, it's something she squeezes in there. She often comes back to like, oh, I've missed 3 weeks. Coleridge was here, right? I'm really behind in my journal. So I think we get that sense too of the way the writing life is impacted by the lived experience and all of the activities she's kind of doing for pleasure, but also doing because she's running this household. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, but those are my thoughts.
One quick addendum I'd add to what Michelle just said on that last point you made. One of the real insights for me in reading the Rydal journals is the degree to which Dorothy kind of resents sometimes when she needs to write. She's not manically returning to the journal every night because she just has to gush about the day's experiences. You know, as Michelle said, she'll go, you know, a week or 2 at a time and fit it in because it's raining outside. Or she'll often talk about, or occasionally talk about, you know, there's nothing else to do, so I wrote letters. It's kind of the opposite, we think, sometimes of our, you know, romantic ideology of I must write. Sometimes for Dorothy, it's I write because there's nothing I can do outside right now.
I think that there is that difficulty of the physical difficulty of writing, which is something that both William and Dorothy do share as well, that neither of them actually like the physical act of writing, which is different to composing and different to thinking about writing. The actual act of putting quill to paper is physically difficult for both of them in different ways. Obviously then comes out in that materiality of the manuscripts, which you talked about so wonderfully in all of those talks, and I think your edition is going to be so brilliant at. This question about the sensitivity, I think, is really interesting because I struggle with this a lot, because there can be a very reductive reading of that as well, particularly in relation to her health, which partly stems from the very earliest kind of descriptions of her as someone who's almost too sensitive to live. You know, she becomes ill because she's too sensitive, which then leads into this kind of it's like kind of hysterical woman syndrome. And then there's a tendency by some people to then kind of pathologize that in a weird way as well, where she only writes such beautiful things about the landscape because she's kind of seeing them pathologically, which in some ways I think is really interesting, but in other ways is oddly reductive as well, because it suggests that she doesn't actually have any innate talent for seeing things. It's just like, yeah, she's seeing a weird thing because she has a migraine or something, rather than because she's actually describing something in a beautiful way. And I think there is an interesting tension between those. Is she seeing things because she's amongst them, or is she seeing things because she's sensitive? And I think it's both, actually. That, and particularly as she gets older and she's less out and about in the world, the fact that she's still writing about her descriptions of the weather that she sees from her window are extraordinary. They're some of the most beautiful bits of nature writing you could ever read. They're written when she's mostly you know, stuck in one room. So I think that is her and the way she sees things as much as her life and what she's doing, if you can ever unentangle those two things.
Thank you so much for these responses. They're very helpful to me. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Lisa. And Richard, I think, was next. Richard Lansdowne with a question, please.
Thank you, Simon, so much. I wanted to ask you, Polly. I'm terribly ignorant about these things and didn't realize that Dorothy wrote much in the way of verse or poetry or anything like as wonderful as that floating island thing. And it reminded me of one or two things of your own, if I may say so, in basic nest architecture or something like that. And I just wanted to ask you a simple question. Is she important to you as a poet?
Yeah, well, I mean, I have guilty confessions here to make as well, that for a long time I didn't really know how much poetry she'd written. And it's partly because, as I think, you know, Richard, that my PhD was focused very much on the Dove Cottage years and on Grasmere, and a lot of these poems are written later. And they're also not very accessible, which is why this digital edition is going to be so important. The Susan Levin edition is amazing, but it's not widely available in the UK. You have to kind of import it in. And I didn't know it existed for a long time. I think it's an amazing resource as well, but this digital edition is going to really change things. So I didn't read a lot of these poems until probably after Basic Nest Architecture was published. I think there are certainly similar concerns, and I think some of the things she writes about, some of the reasons that I really like these poems and go back to them, is because there is a kind of creative sympathy there, I suppose.
Yeah. No, I was very struck. I mean, it's only just seen one, but it sort of strikingly kind of sort of semi-Wordsworthian, if you know what I mean. It's like you could say, okay, so she might be related to Wordsworth, but it's just a very different, she has a very different mind, seems to me.
But there's these really interesting things that happen as well in the poems, where her poems are in conversation with his poems in the same way that his poems are in conversation with her journals. And those same kind of themes of particularly of memory and revisiting places in the mind kind of go round and round. And she writes a lot in these poems, the Sickbed Consolations, about Tintern Abbey as well, because partly because it becomes almost like a prophecy, that it can kind of provide healing to her, which obviously it can't. So there's a failure that goes on there, which is really interesting as well, that it doesn't provide healing, but it does, maybe there's some kind of consolation. So she's continually kind of writing back to Tintern Abbey, which I find fascinating too. I don't know if the rest of you guys picked up on it, that when you were doing your editing as well.
It's an oddly modern feel to stuff. Anyway, thank you, Polly. Brilliant stuff. Can't wait for the book.
Thank you.
I should say, Polly, just as a footnote, I mean, that was something we did discuss, and it goes back to what Michelle said about debating over how much to bring out the intertextuality, right? How much to foreground Dorothy's own writing as against what she's doing in conversation with others. That Thoughts on My Sickbed poem, right, it's rewriting Tintern Abbey. It's in conversation with Coleridge's Lime Tree poem. And I can't remember when we counted up how many of William's poems that poem directly references, right? So that's just part of the medium of Dorothy Wordsworth's mind, right? And the way she processes the world. But yeah, at the same time, it's very possible to overwhelm a poem like that with annotation and make it secondary to all those other concerns. So yeah, it's an interesting problem to think through.
You could see a kind of like hypertext of at least some of those poems, so a bit like the Wasteland hypertext, where
we actually talked about doing that, didn't we, Michelle? Building a tool that would have all of the poems that poem was intersecting with. In the end, we didn't build it, but I guess we still could.
For fun.
It's our version of the rainy day project, you know, except we don't get rain in Utah, so.
It often rains in the Lake District, of course, so it seems
Yeah,
appropriate.
I could send you some.
Yeah. So we've got 2 more questions from Bruce and Patty. They may be the last 2 we have time for. We'll see how we get on. But Bruce, over to you, please.
Yeah, this is a question, and I'm leaving my video off because my connection has been jabbering. But I'm, as someone who jumped very early into the electronic editing world and has experienced what happens over time to electronic editions, particularly when they're dependent on very particular software. How are you going to deal with this when 5 years from now the computers won't run your video stuff?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'll be interested to hear what everyone says about this. You can imagine that there was considerable hand-wringing on our part when we were trying to decide what the best platform was. And I might mention we're in the middle of this nightmare right now, Bruce, or rather the Romantic Circles people are, because they built the new version of the website with a version of Drupal, which is now becoming obsolete and will not be supported. They're in the middle of trying to figure out how to migrate all of that content forward and to keep it accessible. We knew that
probably going to do our edition in of Lyrical Ballads because they've already got us on a separate server.
Right, on sort of on the legacy site, right? And yeah, and that edition, yeah, remains so valuable, and you worry that people won't be able to find it. So, you know, time will tell. I mean, we are worried that there's something or intrinsically ephemeral about the digital format. We were comforted by the fact that at least with Romantic Circles, there's considerable commitment and institutional support to keeping this alive and to not losing any of the legacy content. But you know, we've also worried that frankly, there's not the same cachet yet for digital editions that there is for print editions, even when they're really well done. And what we've learned from our previous experience with the Guide to the Lakes is that people are using the tool. It gets all kinds of hits, and people tell us, oh, it's been so useful to me in my research. And yet when you look at their bibliographies, they don't cite it. Right, they still go to you know, the definitive print editions. So yeah, I mean, clearly it's a problem that we're aware of, and we did a risk-benefit analysis, and we decided that it was worth trying, mostly for the accessibility that this would create, yeah, and just the way it would open up Dorothy Wordsworth to new audiences. But yeah, Michelle, Nick, any responses to Bruce's very real and pressing question?
Before you do that, I just want to ask, is there a definitive print edition of the Guide to the Lakes?
Well, Owen and Smizer in the prose works.
Yeah, I know that, but.
Yeah, but in terms of an accessible print edition, no. I mean, it's.
No. People still are working with reprints of de Selencourt's edition usually.
Yeah. There isn't, certainly, because we thought about doing one last year and then didn't because of the pandemic. because there isn't a kind of reading text available to the public really at all. And there's quite a few things like that just aren't very available. Even of William's work that you think of as kind of classic things, apart from the kind of really expensive academic editions, there's not reading text at all.
Yeah, and another challenge, I mean, to build on Bruce's question, which is really a good, I mean, it is the pressing question. On the one hand, the digital platform is so wonderful in so many ways, but we know for sure these books on my shelf will still be usable in 20 years. We aren't so sure about the others. The other question is, with something like the Guide to the Lakes, where you could imagine, not many, but a fraction of readers wanting to have it on their cell phone as they're out hiking the hills, how do you design that? We mainly are thinking of something for a big monitor, but and fortunately that's more at the back end, at the Romantic Circles end, but it does, both expand and limit your thinking about what you can do.
Thanks very
I'll
much.
just say
Nick.
we've had many, sorry, Simon, just briefly, we've had many occasions where we've had second thoughts. Should we jettison the digital and go to print? And I think that there's really no right answer. Yeah.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm just going to go to Patty for what will need to be the final question of this brilliant session. Patty. You're just on mute there, Patty, I think.
Okay, thank you, everybody. That was wonderful. I was interested particularly in Paul mentioning that you had a kind of index of people attached to the version, because I think that gives scope for further research on Dorothy's life and the Wordsworths in general, from visitors and others whose letters and whose journals and all the rest of it are in other archives. And at least having these names available to scholars will open up research in a much wider sense. And you may have a two-way view of what was going on in the cottage and in Rydal Mount, rather, from that. So I'd like to thank you for that. And I'm really looking forward to that, because I know that from my own research, it's often the things outside the circle that provide of various writers and so on, that provide insights and information about their lives.
I have to say, we were inspired in part by what the editors have done with the Southey letters. If you're familiar with that resource, I find myself going to it repeatedly, what Tim Fulford and all his colleagues have done. So yeah, I hope we've provided something similarly useful, if not quite as extensive.
Right.
I thanks so much for that comment, Patty. That makes me feel good about all of the times. I mean, I will spend entire days tracing the Barlows or the Carltons, but sometimes you'll come across just these random people in the village of Ambleside. Some of them are real rogues. Some of them had backstories that they didn't end up there by choice. And I end up, I don't think of myself as a genealogist, but I'm using the genealogy websites, and I can't help it. But I probably have spent 20 hours over the summer updating these genealogy websites to get the details right for future people, because it's a great area for researching these things. We can do things relatively easily via the internet that just could never have been done before, and it's really exciting time to be doing that kind of work. I'd agree, and that's why I want to cheer you on, because I think it's fantastic, the networks that are created through the internet and through the genealogy sites, especially, and the newspaper sites. You really get somewhere with names.
Well, thanks very much, Patty. I mean, that's a really nice positive note to end on. And I think it just reminds us of how useful this resource and Polly's book are going to be to us all in so many different ways. I'm going to hand back to Nick in just a second. So it just remains for me to again thank Polly and Nick and Michelle and Paul for a really wonderful session building on Bruce's lecture too, which I think has really just illustrated how much exciting and valuable work is going on in the year of Dorothy's 250th anniversary. So thanks very much indeed to you all, and I will hand back to Nick.
Thanks very much, Bruce, and thanks to all four of our speakers this afternoon for giving us such a wonderfully multidimensional and multifaceted approach to Dorothy Wordsworth, bringing us right up to the moment with current work on her writings. I want to bring in Paige at this point as I try and give a kind of concluding summary of what we've been through in the last 6 hours. Paige, are you there?
I am, yes. Well, I would say, go ahead, Nick, go.
You go ahead first.
Well, I was just going to say, for me, the last 6 hours have just been pure enjoyment. So we started at 3:30 in the morning, and I didn't feel like I had woken up early. I didn't feel sleepy-eyed. I've just been thoroughly entertained and engaged, and very grateful to all the panelists for their wonderful and insightful papers today. We have managed to record everything. The next step is for me to figure out logistics of posting that in a way where we can host it and it doesn't take up too much data. If that's on the Wordsworth website, that would be ideal. If not, it'll probably be somewhere like YouTube, but I will certainly send follow-up information, which will be on the website. And hopefully I can even email all of the attendees and participants via Eventbrite.
Yeah, that was the point I was going to make as well. It's an exceptionally memorable 6-hour snapshot of Wordsworth and Dorothy Wordsworth studies in 2021. And I think obviously it's been recorded, but I also think this is going to be tremendously valuable for people who want to listen to the recording this year, let's say, next year, but in 5 years and possibly 10 years' time, assuming, of course, this kind of database, this kind of facility is still working. I thought the comments that Paul made towards the end of his presentation on the preservation of legacy content and the way in which the software and the various electronic systems that we use present tremendous challenges to ensuring that work is preserved in a suitable format. Well, it's been a Wordsworth Conference Foundation event for which I'd like to thank you all very warmly, and all of our speakers for what I've been thinking this afternoon is all foundational work. That seems to me to be the thread that links us, despite, in addition to our two authors. We started yesterday evening with the new museum at Town End. The whole building has been refurbished and expanded, and Jeff began proceedings literally by giving us a new view of Grasmere Vale from the roof of the museum, a rooftop view that has never been seen before. We've had new approaches to William and Dorothy Wordsworth in our panel this morning. We heard fascinating information about Polly Atkin's new biography of Dorothy Wordsworth earlier this afternoon, and we've heard all about the new electronic edition of Dorothy Wordsworth's writing, and all, as I said, all the multifaceted possibilities that opens up, to use a phrase that was mentioned during those presentations. It opens up all sorts of new possibilities for interpreting her achievement and for future scholars to further their own work on what she has done. I was struck as well by how common to much of the work that we've heard today is a preoccupation with landscapes of various kinds. The viewing station on the new museum, mountaineering in the UK and in the Alps, Lake District excursions at Ullswater and on Scafell, and in a slightly different, perhaps more figurative sense, the different literary terrains of romantic writing in the 3 papers that we heard this morning about William Wordsworth. It's difficult to believe that in 6 hours so much first-rate foundational work could be presented, as I say, in such a short time. So it remains for me to thank you all very warmly for being here, the speakers who prepared their papers and the talks, and the panel this morning and this afternoon. And of course, all of our registered listeners who've been remarkably consistent in their numbers across last night and today. We've hovered between the mid-50s and the mid-70s, which is a remarkable achievement, I think, particularly in an event that is taking place at the weekend. So as Paige said, she began at 3:30 in the morning. I guess Lisa Vargo did too, and probably Michelle, if she's at Simon Fraser University. Some of our other participants, Sayako in Kobe and Elias in Sydney, are going to bed long after midnight.